would think that things would get better, right? I'm sorry, we're still in the Middle Ages. I'm sorry, we're still in a very difficult time in church history. And this is, out of chapter 32 of Gonzalez's book, and it's entitled Collapse. As if it wasn't before, yes. It's quite interesting. And what we're going to do this morning is we're really going to be looking at some of the dynamics of change. This is something that, this gives us the opportunity to step back and sort of see how God has used, and again, this is really, I really want to try to emphasize how God has used the events in history to actually bring about Reformation. Sometimes you have to get to the point where it gets so bad and so dark that people are ready for change. Have you ever thought about that? We talk about people, they're going to change, they have to be willing to change. If everything's like, I can kind of get along with it without change, you can bring truth all you want to, and they just kind of stare back at you. And so you also have to have the ingredients of conditions in the society and the culture to allow change, right? God doesn't just go poof, poof, kind of a thing. You wish he would sometimes. So what we're going to see is we're going to see the dynamic of the cultural changes which are going to enable or permit the Reformation and theologic change and other things that come along with it. And we're going to see that both in the secular side and in the church side. And as much as we kind of look at these people sometimes and go, wow, why didn't they see this? Why didn't they see that? They did. Many of them. They just couldn't do anything about it, right? You could be a serf in a small church, you're on your feudal lord's land, and there's this faithful priest trying to teach you the best they can, because remember, you don't have a lot of education, you don't have a lot of knowledge, you don't have a lot of anything, and you're, just fighting for your life, and you're trying to honor God. What power do you have to change anything besides get on your knees and pray? You don't. I mean, we are enamored with the, I have the vote and I can change things. Yeah, we can think that. It feels better when we say things like that. But back then they didn't even have that. They didn't have any of that. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at this transition time period and all the things that are going to set up, some of the historic events, some of the economic and cultural things that are going to allow Reformation to happen, both desire and capability. Okay? And both of those ingredients need to be there. And God's going to do that. So don't ever despair. God's working even when you don't see it, and even in this, God was still working. So I think it's, even though it's a little depressing from one perspective, it's also very encouraging from another. So let's take a look at these changes. Now, the Pope in Innocent III, and we talked about this last week, Innocent III, which was the Fourth Lateran Council, was 1215. So we're talking about the 12, 13, 1400s time periods. We're going to be looking at some of those things, mostly 12 and 1300s this morning, early 1400s. That is kind of what most scholars say, that's the pinnacle of the papacy. In other words, this one guy had so much power. The council, I think, lasted like 3 days or 4 days, and they passed everything. I mean, with all these different people. I mean, you can't get a sandwich order together, or what do we want for pizza in 3 days with that many people? It's much less theologic things. And he just went bang, 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 and they went, we agree. And that was it. So he basically, at this point, held so much power over Europe and over the church that he could pretty much do whatever he wanted. Well, that was the pinnacle. After that, we're going to start, seeing this downward trend. As a matter of fact, by the end of this lesson, you're going to see the credibility of the papacy pretty well shot. We're going to see it come back to power later, but right now, it's going to basically go into this big collapse mode, and there's a lot of reasons for it. So the first thing we're going to look at is sort of the changes in church and state relationships. And the first ones are economic. And we might not think about it too much, but how things function economically do affect how church and state and people and all interact. It's just the environment that they live in, that's going to change the dynamic. And as we look at this, we see that the Crusades, which were going on from right before 1100 to right towards the end of 1300, about a 200-year period, the Crusades, we've talked about this already, they basically opened up what was used to be no trade. It was kind of like East, West, North Africa, and very limited trade. Very limited cross-cultural interaction, very little educational exchange, very little, pretty much anything. It was very isolated, very regional, and that's why you had a feudal economy, right? And a feudal economy is based on what? Land. All wealth is based in land. And we saw during the Crusades, Richard the Lionhearted was ransomed for coinage. And so we're starting to see this development of coins and money and trade. And we're going to talk a little bit about the educational things here in a minute. But if you think about it, it's been nearly 600 years. Think about this, 600 years since there's been any real coinage used as a medium of exchange. I mean, there's all little bits and pieces and stuff like that. But I'll trade you my daughter for your orchard, for that thing, for this fort, and 2 nights and 3 pigs and a cow and 2 lands and whatever else. And a partridge in a pear tree, yes. 12 lords a leaping and everything. Of course, that's much later. But you end up with this whole understanding that I can't just pull out something and say, here, this is a fair exchange for whatever you're giving me in coins. That's a common idea for us that was almost unheard of for nearly 600 years. Amazing difference of what an economy looks like when you can do that kind of an exchange. So you begin trading all this stuff, and the real reason why this stuff developed was because of the Crusades themselves. Okay, you're a wealthy landowner or you have stuff in Germany. How do you buy supplies and whatever along the way to get to Jerusalem? I'll trade you a parcel here on Mount whatever, and the person's going, I need something. And interestingly enough, the Knights Templar in particular became, remember we talked about the military monastic order, who were there to help protect the pilgrims and all that kind of stuff. They developed modern banking techniques. Matter of fact, most of the modern banking techniques that we see were developed during that particular time. There is even some speculative and reasonable evidence that the Swiss banking system, because Switzerland became the major bankers of Europe, they're formed based on Templars who actually fled from some of the events here that ended up in Switzerland, who actually took those techniques and developed that whole banking system in Switzerland. And so they began this whole development. Also, Jewish merchants get into merchants and banking. How good's that going to go for the Jews, do you think? Not so good. And we're going to see there's other things that things aren't going to go well for them. Things aren't going to go well for the Templars either. By the end of this lesson, you'll find out the Templars are not going to fare well eventually for particular reasons. Now, if there are banks and there are money and there is trade, what do you think is going to rise out of that? What do you think is going to be one of the things that's going to happen?
Relation of power and nationality.
Okay, we're going to talk about national rise, yes.
Corruption.
Well, corruption, that's just given, yeah.
Is it middle class? You're not just going to have the kings and the serfs anymore. You're going to
Okay.
have a layer of
We won't call them middle class quite yet, but the wonderful French word is bourgeoisie, or bourgeoisie. What's the proper pronunciation? Bourgeoisie, okay? City dwellers. City dwellers, because you can now reside in a city, you can trade, you can bank, you can exchange things, because now there's a system to do it. And so now you have this merchant class, and the guild system eventually develops out of this and all sorts of stuff like that. They become very powerful and very effective. Well, guess what? If you have people with money, people with trade, you can exchange things for coinage. Who do you think is going to be most helped by that kind of an economic system, and who do you think is going to be most hurt by that economic system? Well, possibly. It actually provides some upper mobility. But I'm thinking of within the ruling classes. Who do you think is going to benefit from that?
People who make the coins.
Okay, people who make the coinage, sure.
Those who own the cities.
The ones who are in the cities, they're going to certainly profit from it.
The ones that own the land are the ones that are going to be hurt because now their land isn't worth as much.
Yeah,
It's not as in
the landowners are going to be the ones hurt to begin with because it's not transferable wealth. You can't get involved in trade with land. And then who do you think is going to be most helped in that power struggle?
the merchants.
Okay.
Are going to be most helped because now there's a group of people that aren't ruled by land. They
Yep.
have their source of power is completely
Yeah.
different.
The rise of the merchant class they're going to be benefiting. So this is going to provide another mobility. Before it was just the church and the monasteries and things like that a poor person could rise to power. Now you have power within the merchant class. Now, you've already mentioned this about the rise of something else that's going to happen. Think of a guy like Charlemagne. How might this help? The monarchy. Yeah, the monarchy is going to be helped because, see, monarchy, okay, I've only got so much land I can divvy up. But if I want to quell that noble in Burgundia and I'm in, Normandy, how am I going to do it? I have to do it by raising troops. I have to do it by buying stuff. So who do you think is going to look to the merchant class and the bankers for power and influence? The monarchy. Now, why would that be good for the merchant class? Remember, these guys are out to make a buck. Why is this going to be good for them?
Is it about influence?
Okay, they're going to have influence.
Are they not loyal to any particular king, though?
Well, they certainly are not loyal to anybody except making the money. But what is the advantage of a centralized government when it comes to trade and business? They set up the rules, and therefore they can quell obstinate local nobles who are putting up trade barriers and tariffs and saying you can't cross my land or cross my bridge without paying all this extra money. And if you have 2,700 of these little guys you have to go across, what's happening? Your profits, you got to buy it really, 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 really cheap and sell it really, really, really expensive because of all these taxes effectively. So if the government steps in and says, unified tax structure, here's the maximum tolls you can charge, and the only person who can do that is the king, who can enforce that from a national perspective. So there's a great benefit for the mercantile class to ally themselves with a monarchy who now is in a power struggle with local nobles. Okay, now switch over to the religious side. Who thinks they're in charge of Europe? The Pope. And who thinks they're in charge of the kings? The Pope. And let's see. So these guys can build armies. These guys can build power. These guys can control vast areas. And they're in charge of it now. The Pope tries to build armies. There's a small conflict here. So you have nobles. So you're starting to see what's going on here. Because, see, who was in charge of Europe for so long? The Pope or the Church. Because they were the only thing left standing after the collapse. Well, you would think a God-honoring Pope and Church would say, praise God, hallelujah, we can step out of this mess. And there were a lot of them who wanted to. So I'm not going to tell you, okay, the popes are all evil. Some of these guys really, truly said, we need to be God's shepherds over God's flock. But after 600 years of absolute power, or effectively absolute power, don't you think there might be a few bad apples who got in there? And remember, you had the practice of seminary and all these other kind of stuff, and nepotism, and I scratch your back, you scratch mine, and they have all these things. But the world is changing economically, politically, and we're going to see here in a second, socially. But one of the other things that happens out of this is in 1347. Remember we talked about one of the things that hurt Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire? Remember one of the things was disease, plague. Remember I told you that this is going to continue on? Well, in 1347, the bubonic plague came back with a vengeance. Scholars estimate more than a third of the population of Europe died. So if you had, say, 100 million people across all of Europe, that means 30 million people dead. Now, in some cases, that's really bad, and in other cases, it's really good, because now you get to divide that third of the loot and the land and the livestock and whatever amongst the survivors. However, if you're in a place that doesn't get hit bad, and there's another place that got really devastated you were trading with, what happens to the people who are left over here? What happened to their trade or their ability to do stuff? Your trade's destroyed. So unemployment and violence and all sorts of other stuff. Some places in Europe, they had a death toll of 70%.
That's what actually happened after World War I.
Yeah, World War I had similar type of a problem. Yeah, certain areas of France and Germany were untouched, and other areas were devastated. So you get all sorts of stuff that goes along with that. What's that?
World War I, is that the Spanish flu?
And then the Spanish flu hit in the middle of World War I too.
Oh,
Like the United States went into an isolation mode.
Yeah.
The issue was there was no one for Europe to trade with, so
Yeah.
they could recover, and there was all these kind of balances.
Yeah, you have all sorts of problems when you have a world economy. When one area gets destroyed that you're trading with or trading from, you got problems. Now, the other problem that you get into here, and now think about, let's switch over to theology.
Sorry,
Yeah.
before you leave the idea of the money, how do the mercantile classes perceive the papacy? Were they for, against, neutral? Did they align themselves with the king?
The mercantile class tended to align themselves with the monarchy because they knew they had more growing power. But that didn't mean that they weren't working with the papacy also,
Yeah,
because whoever needed money. But the church didn't need money at this time. It was the monarchs who did.
who was the guy that when the coin into the coffer, the coin rings?
Oh, Tetzel? That's the guy during the Reformation.
Yeah.
Later on, they needed the money.
The mercantile class now starts selling church wares.
Yes, the mercantile class will sell church trinkets. Yeah, that's how they make up with the fall. That's a little bit later on during the Reformation. Now, what we find out, though, is this economic viability starts being hurt. But what do you think happens from a theological perspective? What would people see? And again, I'm not saying what they should see, but what will people see, especially if you're not very well taught? What will they see when plague wipes out 30% of the population? Disillusionment with who? Church and God.
That God doesn't care about us.
Yeah.
How dare God do this? He doesn't love us anyway.
Yeah, and you can now figure out there's all sorts of different angles you can take on this. You can say, see, we need to return, like, remember Julian the Pagan? We need to return back to following under the Pope. Okay? Or whatever, Jupiter at that time. Or you could say, God doesn't exist. Or you could say, we've sinned and this is just punishment. Or, what do we have to do to get God not to be mad at us? Or, all depends on how good your theology is and how well balanced it is. But you can see the cracks with ignorance and superstition and lack of education and lack of training. And now you got these popes fighting kings, fighting nobles, fighting whatever. And you just continue this, people sitting in the pew going, what do I do? Which way do I turn? Who am I loyal to? Am I loyal to the Pope? Am I loyal to the king? Am I loyal to the noble? Is God mad at us? Did we sin? What's going to happen here? And so,
Really hard in Germany, because in
yeah.
Germany it wasn't just the Pope, it wasn't just the Emperor, because the Emperor was elected by the nobles who kept power over the Emperor, and so there's always a power struggle. So
There's always a power struggle, yeah.
Who's in charge, and who can I blame for this? Because everybody always likes to blame the leaders.
Yeah. And so what ends up happening is you start getting all sorts of different reactions to this. And some of them are just fear. Some of them are anger. Some of them are, well, we just need to have more penance. Remember that thing we talked about a long time ago, the misunderstanding of repentance and penance? Well, that idea of penance has continued to grow, so I guess we just need to have more extreme forms. And they actually had these guys, they called them the flagellates, and they would beat themselves, with flagella, the whips, and they whipped that stuff. And there are, of course, Monty Python skit spoofs on that, they hit themselves with the head. It's that whole thing. And so you start seeing all of this stuff going on. And other people say, chuck it. And other people are confused. The problem that you get into now is you also have all of these relics. Remember we mentioned the relics that came back from the Crusades? And what do they now start doing? Venerating them. Well, this is the power of this saint, or this is this cross, or this is from this holy place. And so now what do you start doing when the plague comes? Yeah, they idol worship. Let's parade this through the street, and let's start praying to Mary more, and let's start doing, So you start turning to basically pagan rituals with a Christian twist to them. Yeah, we've looped all the way back. Remember we talked about that continuity versus transcendent worldview? Well, if you have no transcendent worldview, what are you going to turn into? You're going to have that continuity worldview. You're going to start looking back to nature and God's going to do this if we do that, and we're going to please Him, kind of a thinking. Question?
So with all these different reactions, what does the Pope have to say? Can't he just make some statement on here's what we should be thinking, or
well,
kind of corral people's thoughts?
The Pope is mostly now locked in, not all of them, because we're going to see the difference between them, is locked in a battle with the monarchy and all, because they want to maintain power. They're very disinterested, for most of them, not all of them, in theologic things. Because what has happened theologically? They have fallen back into the traditional interpretive thing. The Father said this, and here's what happens, and here's the superstition when the gap's filled. Nobody's educated. We're going to talk about the political and educational changes. So you're seeing all these dynamics. As much as we stand back here and just presume, because we're educated. I can hand out notes and you can read them. I can use polysyllabic words, and you understand them. Poly, yeah.
Isn't it about power too?
Well, power, corruption,
they
yeah.
don't concerned about the relics and all that, as long as there's more people coming to the church.
Yeah, they want
More people is more power.
more people is more power, more money, more whatever.
It takes,
But a lot of these people, this was not about more power. They really, literally believed if we pray to the saint and there's these miracles. And I heard that at this abbey, if you go there, this person was healed. Sound familiar? We have it today.
Yeah, they think
And
that.
if you go into a good, quote, good Catholic home today,
Mm-hmm.
you will see lots of stuff.
Yeah.
Lots of relics.
Yeah, there's all sorts of stuff that happens.
So there's also the idea that they've had 1,000 years of theology. So at this point, the Pope wants to keep power. And one of the ways you keep power is to keep the status quo.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, it was a little bit of an arrogance. It was a little bit of power struggle. There are no theological questions left to answer.
Yeah.
in their mind.
Yeah, they've answered their theology. They're now maintaining.
We don't want the Copernicuses. We don't want the
Right.
Galileos. We don't want the Luthers.
Yeah.
Because they're throwing rocks into our lake.
Right.
Our nice, calm lake that we
Yes.
have everything figured out, and they're making waves.
Right.
And we don't want that.
Yeah.
Because they're shaking things up. And to be honest with you, that's exactly what we need. The archaeology is finding new things. We're learning more things about these cultures. We need to keep reading our Bibles to understand them better. It's not to say that there's a different theology, but there is more and more things that we can learn that we're discovering. So
Yeah.
I think it's, to a degree,
Yeah.
theologically,
Yeah,
the folks weren't interested because what else is there to learn? We've
Right.
already answered every question. We've got
Yeah.
1,000 years of theology that covers pretty much every topic, right? At this point now, it's just about declaring who's a heretic.
Yeah, right now we're gonna see that there's so much stuff that's going on. And again, anything that's challenged, what's the natural reaction to anything? If you're ever challenged, what's your first reaction? Not saying what's your proper reaction or second reaction is to get defensive, right? And again, that's just our natural reaction. Step back and defend. Well, and that's what they do. They step back and defend. But in their defense, what ends up happening is problems. And then we're going to see how this all flows out. So the political idea, as we've mentioned this, I'm just going to touch on it, is people after the Crusades used to have the allegiance. Remember the first Crusades, they were getting nobles. When they got to the second Crusade, it was the king. So originally you were looking for your noble to lead you, sort of like your company commander or your corps commander. And now, and by the second and third and fourth Crusades, these were kings leading it. So now who are you looking to? Kings. And that means they're the king of something. France, Germany, England, Scotland, etc., etc., etc. So now the idea of national identity, from tribalism and feudalism and regionalism to nationalism, right? And so these ideas of national monarchies and power bases start coming into play. Well, the bigger they are, the more power they have, the harder they are going to be able to control. So we end up with the wars. And anybody familiar with European history? England and France are buddies, right? And have been buddies for a very, 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 not even close. There's a tenuous peace right now, but I mean the history of England and France over 1,000 years.
Well, in our history.
Yeah, they don't get along well, regardless of whether they are allied or not. They don't get along well, and guess what happens? There was this thing called the 100 Years' War. It lasted more than 100 years, but I think they do it because there's like 100 years of constant warfare during this time period between England and France. And of course, with you got England and France involved, you have everybody else on the European continent involved. And if everybody in the European continent is involved, guess who else is involved? The church and the papacy. So you end up with all of these different things. Some of the historic events, just as a reference, the Battle of Crécy and Agincourt. And if you like any Shakespeare, the only one I would highly recommend is Henry V. No, because he basically chronicles this one. Kenneth Branaugh did a really nice job one. That's actually a very, very well done one. But that is actually this time period, and Shakespeare wrote about it. And all of these different things, classic battles, English longbowmen, French knights, whole big deal, kind of a cool military transition. But this is what goes on during this time period. And the English win that battle to press their claim to the English throne, or the French throne. So remember, the Normans went over and took England, but guess what? They had land back in France, so they're trying to press to get the French throne, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes behind that. Well, of course, the French are going to react, and later on we have Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, and she leads the French army to victory over the English after she got a vision from God that the Dauphin, or the Prince Charles VI's son, was to be king. Rallied the French troops. They beat the English back. She's eventually captured by the English and are sold to the bishop. I think it's Beauvier is the pronunciation. I could be wrong. Who tries her as a heretic and a witch. Because, of course, if she's hearing things and visions and whatever, she must be a witch because she beat the English. Yes, she weighed more than a duck. And Joan first recanted, but then she had another vision from Saints Catherine and Margaret. Sound familiar? So she took her recantation back and gets burned at the stake in 1431. 20 years later, Charles VII reviews the trial and declares her innocent, and she's declared a saint of the Catholic Church in 1920 by Benedict XV. 1920 is when she was declared a saint of the Catholic Church. She was already a heroine of France. So if you notice, she dies in 1431. She's declared a saint of the Catholic Church in 1920.
And she's immortalized in Bill and Ted's.
Yes, she is immortalized in some interesting movies, yes. So this is what's going on here. The 100 Years' War, it's just constant. So how would you like to, we think, oh yes, we've been involved in wars for, a decade. How would you like to do over 140 years constantly being at war? Things were so good otherwise. You had the plague, remember? Let's see, bubonic plague starts in, 1347, so you're now, you've had bubonic plague, you've had, it's a nightmare.
That
So.
relationship is fascinating between England and France. If you ever watch it,
Oh yeah, England and France relationship was.
World War II, you have Charles de Gaulle sitting on French shores, looking back at France, talking about how he's going to come back and take it back to the Germans.
Yeah.
That back and forth between those two countries.
Yeah.
Like
Allies and enemies and enemies and allies, and it's politics is quite fascinating. But if you notice here, we have church, we have religion, we have I'll condemn you because of this, and then I'll say. It's crazy. So these are all the things going on. Educational changes, though. Here's something that actually very positive, which sets up for the Reformation that comes out of this. And this is all these texts start coming back from Greek texts from Byzantium. Remember there on the Fourth Crusade, the Crusaders actually sacked Constantinople and reunited the church for about 50 years. It was kind of crazy. But they bring these Greek texts and these manuscripts back. Remember the city of Cordoba? This is where the Moors had kept, or the Islamic Moors had kept a lot of educational learning through Greek and Latin and all sorts of stuff. And you also got the trade that they brought from India and algebra and mathematics and all that kind of stuff starts bringing back in. Philosophy, Plato, Aristotle. So now you start seeing that part of that trade and part of that interaction now brings education back. Now I'm not saying that it has a tremendous effect to start with, because it doesn't. But you get Thomas Aquinas during these times. You get guys trying to study the Bible better. You're starting to see a slow rebirth of education and provides the foundation for the Reformation. Without these texts, without these language, without the philosophy, without schools, the university system starts being set up during this particular time. So now you start getting Oxford and University of Paris and all these other kinds of stuff. Yeah, a little bit of archaeology that gets in there. People start finding out what's going on. And so suddenly you get education. Now, how good is superstition and ignorance for biblical studies? You know, we promote that, right? We want you to remain superstitious and ignorant so we can tell you what. No. Yeah, it depends, yeah. But see, without that, you can't go back and study. You can't go back and learn. You're just going to go based on whatever, forgive me, old wives' tales, because the Bible uses that expression, of what's going on and how should work and back to signs and omens and whatever else happened. So you have to have education. Well, all this affects, now again, setting up the political environment, setting up the economic environment, now setting up the educational environment for the Reformation to start growing from.
Right. At this point, did England start standardizing English and France started standardizing French to a degree because as they're trying to unify the tax laws and everything else, they had to come up with a single language so that they could actually pass one edict. Was that happening at this time?
They were beginning, as the educational system starts, beginning to what you would consider Middle English and Middle French. It's really the Reformation time period where German, French, and English get standardized. What we would consider modern English.
Education was all in Latin.
Yeah, they were still Latin, yeah.
In 1350, they would have been teaching Latin.
Yeah. Yeah, it would still be all Latin at this particular time in the education. Matter of fact, Latin and Greek were principal languages in education for a very, very long time.
In France, I don't remember what date it is, but standardization of language was really important, and that was how they became France. That was how they got rid of all the little duchies all over the country. They banned all the other languages.
Yeah.
And said that you have to speak French. I don't remember what date it was.
Yeah, French started dominating, and it was really Calvin's translation of the Bible into French, which modern French is developed out of. Same thing with the King James Bible for standardization of modern English, though there was a transition through that time period. But the Bibles became the standardization of language and grammar and syntax later on. But this was beginning that whole transition, yeah, because you have to govern, you've got to have a language that everybody speaks.
And then when was the printing press?
Printing press, Gutenberg, 14-something? It was before the Reformation, so it was like 1430, 1440, and then it started moving in there, and that's when the Reformation starts taking advantage of it. So we're closing in on all those things.
This time was handwritten.
Everything was handwritten. That's where the monasteries came in, the copyists, all these different things. So you see all the stuff that's been going on, God's been using it. We just couldn't see it. They couldn't see it. And that's what I'm trying to say is what's going on right now in our country and in this world, God is still using. We just may not be able to see it. We can look back and examine God set the Reformation up through a lot of good and bad things. He used it all, remember? He's going to use it all to good for those who love Him, those who are called according to His purpose. This is the Bible being worked out in history. God's Word, real and living. And so education has changed. Now, in the religious area, we see the problem that there is a reform. Remember, not all these guys are bad. These guys saw simony, nepotism, opulence, pomp. The people, whether they knew their theology well or not, recognized this was wrong. And many of the leaders recognized this was wrong. We talked about the monastic movements. We talked about some of the reforming popes. The problem is they didn't necessarily work so well. And so there were people trying to reform the church, the behavior, the papacy, etc. The problem that we get, and here's the example we use in the notes here, Celestine V and Boniface VIII. Two kind of extreme forms, but they give you a good representation. Celestine V was an incredibly humble, austere, wanted to bring reformation and renewal to the church and Europe and everything through the Franciscan, that simplicity, let's have nothing, poverty kind of a thing. And unfortunately, remember the Franciscans also lean towards the let's not get smart versus the Dominicans who said let's study. Okay? You end up with a guy like him, and how good is lack of education, lack of quote-unquote worldly wisdom going to work against the courts of Europe? Now, you're swimming among sharks. And he was a man who really wanted to do things well, and it didn't work out so well. In contrast, you have Boniface. I mean, this dude knows the system, if you will, knows how to work it and play it and everything else. So he plays power politics. So you got this humble guy who wants to do simplicity, and if we just live godly, it's all going to change. And everybody just looks at him and goes, huh?
He walked away.
Yeah, he ends up walking away. He's like, I'm tired of this. Boniface, on the other hand, he basically gets crushed by the French king, Philip. And he is a guy who uses excommunication and interdict. And there's a difference between excommunication and interdict. Interdict basically says, priests, stop observing, besides the last rites and baptism, all church functions, close the door. Yeah, no sacraments. Of course, by this time, the sacraments and all of these different kinds of things are very important. And how am I going to get into heaven? And and the priests are sitting here going, why? Why should I not be shepherding my flock? And the flock's going, well, why are you shutting the doors, pastor? Or priest, or whatever they wanted to call him then. Why are you shutting the doors? Because the Pope said so. Well, the Pope's using this to put pressure on the people and the nobles to put pressure on the kings to do what he wants.
You can excommunicate the entire country.
Yeah, and you can excommunicate a country. You can excommunicate a king. See, if you excommunicate a king, then guess what? Nobody has loyalty to them. And okay, now create a rebellion. Now, how is you sitting here going, I'm just trying to honor God in my life, and you're a priest trying to say, I'm just trying to shepherd my flock, and this is going on and back and forth and in and out. And oh, by the way, there's these plagues, and the economy's shifting under us, and we got new rulers, and how stable do you think people's minds are?
Not very.
Everything's shifting on them, and they're like, I just want to love God. And some of them go, clearly something's seriously wrong here. So the popes, by trying to do this kind of stuff, end up creating a fracture both in the church and in the governments. And so instead of unifying Europe and unifying the church, they actually, through these processes, fracture Europe and fracture the church. And they create doubt and they create credibility problems. Leaders are only followed if they're credible. I mean, you can put your thumb down on people, but to be followed versus being drug, there's a difference. You have to maintain credibility. Well, the papacy's credibility is fast failing. And Boniface gets basically stomped on. The popes have popes and counter-popes and cardinals electing and unelecting people. And
The emperor invades.
yeah,
Invades Rome again.
yeah, the emperor invades Rome again. So, I mean, you got all sorts of stuff going on. You also find, and I'm not going to go through this, it's in the notes, but Philip IV of France basically declares the Knights Templar heretical. But unfortunately, they're a monastic order, so the only person who has charge over them is, the Pope. And so, of course, they want the Knights Templar are the one guys who are, by the way, knights, and they also happen to be extremely wealthy. So if you're the King of France and you don't want to be interfered with, what do you need to make sure you get rid of? The military. And to fight your wars, what do you need? Money. Hey, they're a bunch of heretics. So the Templars get all sorts of nasty stuff done to them. And it's a back and forth fight between the Pope and counselors and the Philip and all. Question?
I don't think it was just a general desire for money, because the King of France racked up a massive debt with the Templars. They
Oh, yeah.
a bunch of money, and so now they come time to pay, and I guess he doesn't want to pay.
Yeah, the king doesn't want to pay because of his debt, yes, to the Templars and to other people. And so how do I get the money and how do I keep the power? And I mean, so if you notice here, now we got this power politics. So who's the one guy who has to stop the Templars so that the king can get money and funds? The Pope.
The Pope at this point, when he's kicked out of Rome, he went and took residence in France.
Yeah, he gets kicked out and he ends up in France at Avignon, and it's called it's like a Babylonian captivity, 70 years in. It was actually 70 years in Avignon before they returned the papacy back to France or to Rome. And I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. And after all these trials and counter things, the Pope eventually disbands the Templars and says, we're going to give their power and their money elsewhere. And then Philip says, oh, by the way, here's the bill for the trial. You owe me money. So before you distribute any of the wealth to the other monasteries or orders, you owe me. So he gets rid of the thing, he kills their leaders, he takes the knights out, and he gets their money, resolves his debt, and controls the Pope for 70 years. Eventually, the papacy returns to Rome in 377.
The Knights Templar hid most of their treasure underneath Boston.
Yeah, the Knights Templar with Boston, yeah, exactly. Linked with the Masons, who are the part of the Illuminati. No, yeah. There's all sorts of stuff. No, a lot of people, like I said, think the Templars, a lot of them went to Switzerland, hid out there, and started the banking systems with the things they had learned. Now, anybody want to live in medieval Europe right now? No. I mean, it's just a nightmare. But again, all these things God's setting up so the Reformation can happen.
It's also important to remember, I mean, we talk about this quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, these were hundreds of years of
Yeah,
time.
several hundred years worth of process.
Slowly simmering. So while we're going through it so quickly, I mean, they're really it's just like this. You can't see what's going to happen 20 years from now until you look back on it. So,
Yeah. You can see what was going on in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and you can see the ramifications of them now in the 70s, 80s, 90s, crossing into the 21st century. So, last thing is, this is towards the end, right near 1400. Urban VI, so we're right near 1400. He was the Pope in Rome in 378. And the reason we're bringing this up, it looked like about this time everybody's kind of chilled out. We kind of got a new equilibrium, sort of. Because remember, now the Pope's back in Rome. Well, no, it's not. This guy wants to bring unity. He wants to bring reform. He's a humble man, austere life, and bullheaded. And he's not very tactful either. Making knowledge acceptable was not one of his strong points. So, after he does this, he starts going after, of course, all the corruption, right? If you're a reformer, you go after the corruption. How well does that work when most of them are corrupt? It doesn't. And so, of course, as he goes after the people who elected him and other people, they go, let's unelect him. A unique event. This is the first, and as far as I know, the only pope that was elected by a college of cardinals who ticked so many people off that they unelected him. Now, there were rival popes by different cardinals before. We've seen that. But these are the same people. We think you're God's choice. No, you're not. And so then you end up with rival popes and rival cardinal groups, and it just becomes a zoo. And they end up with a papacy in Avignon, because it had just been there recently, and in Rome. And so you got two popes and two sets of cardinals. And what happens in Europe? And what happens in the church? You're going to have to make a choice. Which pope are you following, and why are you following them? And, people switching sides and re-switching sides. And is this helping stability and organization, and we all are together? No. And, of course, everybody takes advantage of that to use their own agenda for whatever purpose they need. And they're supposed to meet together after they go through and re-electing some other popes. So in 394, almost 1400, theologians at the University of Paris, got University of Paris theologians coming to Charles VI and say, hey, here's the solution. Get each of them to resign, and we'll just elect a new pope. How well do you think that one's going to work? Theologians are so wonderful. Hey, here's the right answer. I'm sure everybody will honor God in this, right? Nah. So this fails. The Pope in Avignon dies, and so they say, okay, quick, tell these cardinals don't elect another pope. And of course, that puts them in a weak position, so what do? They elect another pope. And so now you have a Roman pope and an Avignon pope, and you're still... But let's all get together. So in 1407, these guys are not going to work with each other. They eventually are supposed to have a meeting. So they get within like a few miles of each other. In 1407, September, they were supposed to have this meeting. And by May 1408, they hadn't met, even though they were just a few miles from each other. So one of the guys, Benedict XIII, eventually comes to the site. Gregory the 12th says no. And the cardinals both break with both popes and start negotiating with each other to decide, how do we figure out how to get this all to work out? So now you have the cardinals rebelling on both sides against the popes, on both sides.
Trying to unify back together.
Yeah, and trying to unify back together. And so what is going to begin, what has sort of begun, is now beginning a movement. It's called the Councilor movement, which we'll talk about, that they're trying to get councils now, trying to say, okay, let's get, remember back, the Council of Chalcedon, and they're going, hey, it worked back there, let's all get back together here, because this pope thing is not working out, and these kings, and it's a nightmare. So let's try to do that. Let's have councils. How well do you think that one's going to work? Not, because now you have national monarchs who want to put their people over in charge, who want to then get together to have their political agenda. And of course, what's everybody doing? New pope, interdict, excommunication. How much credibility do you think the papacy has right now in the eyes of the general anybody? It's not good. It's really, really, really bad. So when we say collapse, the papacy's authority collapses. Now it's going to come back. Don't worry. It'll come back. But it comes back in a completely different way. But God is still at work. Through all of this slow nightmare, because it's not a fast nightmare like this. It's a slow nightmare. God is still using all these forces, and you see all the stuff he's setting up. People are sick and tired of politics. People are sick and tired in the church saying, we're secular. No, we're not. People are sick and tired of political intrigue. People are becoming educated. Theologians are starting to learn. People are starting to say, that's my monarch, but here's my Lord. All those different things are now becoming available. Economics, mobility, all of that comes into play.
Hypocrisy is something that it doesn't matter whether you're in the church or out of the church, it sticks out.
Yeah,
And
hypocrisy.
So now you're also this follow the papacy, and this hypocrisy in the clergy is going to start creating the Karl Marxism and some of these other guys are going to start coming up with secular systems.
Yeah, secular systems will start rising over time.
I think would be part of it. So all these things that are happening that we're watching, it's not surprising that we start seeing a secularization and humanism and all these things that start to rise now, and they take more shape in a few other years.
Yeah, people will mask humanism under church stuff, but it really is just the rise of man thinking they're better than God. And you can understand why people are disillusioned. That's why our testimony and our witness is so important. They can't just look at us and say, yes, you're just religious people. If they look at you and say you're religious people, you're like everybody else. That's why you have to be Christ-like and honoring and non-Hippocratic. Oh, Hippocratic, yeah.
I think that makes you a doctor.
That's a doctor, yeah. A bad doctor, because non-Hippocratic, yeah. That's why our testimony is so important. It's not just what we know, it's how we live. And if they see us, but these people were put in some tough situations, some very difficult, if you will, moral and theologic and ecclesiastical dilemmas. if you see your Pope doing this and you're supposed to honor them, but then, you know, and that's why later on we start seeing the separatist ideas and the preachers, those independent preachers that, they said, I'm sorry, this is God's word. I don't care what the church is telling me. And then yet, you wait a second, you should be under the church. And I mean, it gets really hairy really, really fast. And there's no real simple answers here.